Good evening and welcome. If you're listening late tonight, wherever you are in the world, take a moment to get comfortable. Lower the lights. Let your shoulders relax. You don't need to focus too hard on anything that follows. Just let the story unfold. Tonight, we are not traveling to palaces, not to gilded halls or mirrors or royal banquets. We are traveling somewhere quieter, into the narrow streets, the crowded rooms, and the ordinary lives of Paris in the 18th century. This is not the Paris of postcards, not the Paris of Versailles. It is the Paris of bakers rising before dawn, of families sharing a single room, of footsteps echoing on stone streets before the sun has fully arrived. Imagine waking up in a city without alarm clocks. A city where the day begins not with schedules, but with light. Where bells, not watches, tell you when time is passing. Where survival is not a philosophy, but a daily habit. In this story, we will follow no kings. We will follow people whose names were never written down. Men and women who worked until their bodies were tired, ate what the season allowed, and learned quietly how to endure. As you listen, you might hear sounds that feel familiar. The murmur of a crowd, the scrape of wooden shoes on stone, the low rhythm of a city breathing through the night. If at any point your mind drifts, that's perfectly fine. And if you'd like, you can tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now slowly, let's step into the streets of 18th century Paris and see what an ordinary day once felt like. Paris did not fall asleep the way cities do today. There was no clear moment when the lights dimmed, no collective pause when the noise finally surrendered to silence. Instead, the city loosened itself slowly, like a body that had worked too long, and was only now beginning to rest, not all at once, but in uneven waves. Even late at night, Paris was never empty. If you were standing there in the early 18th century, perhaps at the mouth of a narrow street near the river, you would still hear movement around you, footsteps echoing against stone, the low groan of a cartwheel turning carefully in the dark, a door opening somewhere above, then closing again. Life did not disappear when night arrived. It simply thinned. Paris at this time was already one of the largest cities in Europe, swollen far beyond what its medieval bones had been designed to contain. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within walls that once imagined far fewer, and they did not live spread out or comfortably apart. They lived pressed together, stacked vertically, life layered upon life. Buildings rose tall and narrow, often 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories high, their upper floors leaning outward as if curious about the street below. The higher you climbed, the cheaper the space became, and the more the ceiling seemed to press down toward your head. At the very top, beneath slanted roofs and thin beams, were the garrets, cramped rooms where heat gathered in summer, where cold crept in during winter, and where the city felt strangely distant, even though it was only a few steps below. An address in Paris was not a number. It was a description, a shared understanding, passed quietly from one person to another. The third door after the baker, above the cobbler, across from the fountain. These directions did not need to be written down because they belonged to a city learned through use rather than design. Streets were not experienced as lines on a map, but as sequences of familiar markers, smells, sounds, corners, and thresholds that repeated themselves day after day. To move through Paris, you did not consult paper or diagrams. You relied on habit, on repetition, on the kind of knowledge that settles into the body without asking for attention. You learned the city with your feet. Each step confirmed what the mind already knew, where the stones dipped slightly near the drain, where the street narrowed just enough to force two bodies to pass carefully where the light faded earlier in the afternoon because a building leaned too far forward. These details were not memorized consciously. They were absorbed through daily movement, through routes walked so often that they required no thought at all. A turn was not a decision. It was an instinct guided by the rhythm of work, of errands, of returning home. Over time, the city arranged itself, not by names or measurements, but by sequences of experience. The smell of bread told you how close you were to the bakery. The sound of water signaled the fountain before it came into view. The change in air cooler and damper announced the river long before you reached it. Even in darkness, Paris remained legible to those who lived within it. The body recognized what the eyes could not see. This way of knowing the city created a quiet intimacy between people and place. You did not feel lost easily because you were never far from something recognizable. Every street led to another already known. Every corner carried a memory of passing through before. Paris was not something you navigated from above. It was something you inhabited from within. And because of this, the city felt continuous, almost endless, even though its boundaries were real. You moved through it as one moves through a familiar room in the dark, slowly, carefully, but with confidence born of repetition. In 18th century Paris, direction was not given by numbers or maps, but by lived experience, by the accumulated memory of countless ordinary journeys repeated until the city itself seemed to guide you forward. Inside these buildings, privacy was not an expectation. It was a rarity. A single room often held an entire family, sometimes more. Sleeping, eating, working, resting, everything happened within the same small rectangle of space. There were no hallways to separate moments of the day, no clear boundaries between one activity and the next. Life overlapped itself constantly. A table served as a workbench by day and a place to eat by night. A bed, if there was one, might be shared. Straw mattresses were common, sometimes nothing more than layered fabric laid out on boards. The air carried the smells of the day: bread, damp wool, smoke, sweat, and these smells did not fade when night arrived. They lingered, becoming part of rest itself. Silence as we understand it today did not exist. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor coughed. Somewhere else, a baby cried. From above came footsteps, from below the murmur of voices drifting upward through open windows. These were not interruptions. They were the texture of night. Paris slept together, whether it wished to or not. Outside, the streets were narrow enough that sound traveled easily. Voices carried upward, bounced between walls, lingered longer than expected. A late argument, a song hummed by someone walking home, the steady call of a night watchman announcing the hour not by clock but by voice. Time in Paris was not measured precisely. It flowed. Bells rang, routines repeated, and people learned when the night was deep, not by minutes passing, but by how the city sounded. Beneath all of this ran the quieter, less visible realities of urban life. Water did not arrive through pipes. It was carried from the river, drawn from public fountains, sold by those strong enough to haul it through the streets. Waste did not disappear. For much of the century, it accumulated, especially at night, when fewer eyes were watching. Paris smelled alive, not in metaphor, but in fact. The city breathed through its people, and they breathed it back. To live on the ground floor was to live close to the street, and the street was never still. It meant waking each morning to the sound of wheels and hooves, to voices rising directly through open doors, to the smell of mud stirred up by passing feet and animals. Commerce unfolded at arm's length. Shops opened directly onto the road with no clear boundary between private space and public life. Work spilled outward, tools and goods extending into the street, conversations blending with movement. The ground floor belonged as much to the city as it did to the people who lived there, and life was lived in constant negotiation with what passed by. To live higher was to climb away from that chaos step by step, leaving the noise behind in gradual stages. But with each flight of stairs, something else was lost. Air grew thinner. Light arrived later in the morning and disappeared sooner in the evening. The upper floors received what the street no longer needed: heat in summer, cold in winter, and whatever sounds remained after distance softened them. Stairs were steep and uneven, never uniform, worn smooth in places by decades of use, and sharp in others where repairs had been hurried or incomplete. They demanded attention. Every climb was an effort measured in breath and muscle. Every descent required care, a hand against the wall, a steady pace learned through repetition. Over time, the city shaped the body as much as the mind. You woke with aches, not from injury, but from the limits of space. The room did not allow for easy movement, and the body adapted by becoming careful. You learned how to turn without knocking into furniture, how to rise without waking others, how to exist within narrow margins. You moved cautiously because the stairs forgave nothing. A misstep meant pain, sometimes worse. And so balance became instinct, caution became habit. You learned to carry what you needed with intention. Water, tools, food, nothing was gathered lightly, because returning meant climbing again. Each journey was considered, each trip weighed against the effort it required. In this way, the architecture of Paris taught economy of movement, patience, and endurance. The city was not simply a place where people lived. It was a structure that quietly trained them, shaping posture, pace, and habit, one step at a time. And yet, for all its crowding and discomfort, Paris was not experienced as temporary. For most people, it was the only world they knew. They were born here, worked here, and many would die here. The city was not a stage upon which life played out. It was a condition of existence. At night, as lamps flickered and shadows stretched across walls that leaned inward, Paris became quieter, but no less dense. Windows remained open for air. Voices passed between floors. Information traveled this way. News, gossip, warnings moving through the city faster than official announcements ever could. Paris listened to itself constantly. If you were an ordinary person lying down at night, you did not think in terms of history or destiny. Those were ideas that belonged to others, to people with distance from hunger and fatigue. Your thoughts stayed closer, nearer to the body and to the next waking moment. You thought in terms of tomorrow, not as a future to be shaped, but as a day to be endured. Would work be steady, or would there be nothing waiting when morning came? Would bread still be affordable, or would the price rise again without warning? Would the stairs be crowded in the morning, slowing your descent, costing you time you could not afford to lose? These questions did not arrive with urgency or fear. They were not sharp enough for that. Instead, they drifted through the mind, quietly settling and lifting like breath. You did not argue with them or seek answers. You simply carried them the way the body carries fatigue, the way it carries hunger until it becomes familiar. Sleep was not interrupted by worry so much as accompanied by it a background presence that neither demanded attention nor fully disappeared. Planning in such a life rarely extended far beyond the coming days. There was little use in imagining a distant future when the immediate one was uncertain. The rhythm of the city did not encourage long horizons. It encouraged adjustment, small, constant recalibrations to whatever the next morning might bring. Certainty in a city this full was fragile. It could be undone by a bad harvest, a closed shop, an illness, or a rumor spreading faster than fact. And yet there was a strange calm in this narrow focus. By keeping attention close on tomorrow, rather than next year on bread, rather than ideals, people learned how to rest within uncertainty. Lying there in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of other lives doing the same, you did not need to know what the city would become. You only needed to trust that it would still be there when you opened your eyes. And yet there was familiarity, not the comfort of ease, but the comfort of recognition. The same stones lay beneath your feet each night, smoothed not by design, but by decades of passing bodies worn into shallow curves by carts, shoes, and repetition. There was always the same corner where the light caught the wall just right in the evening, a narrow band of fading daylight sliding across the plaster at almost, but never exactly the same moment, lingering briefly before dissolving into shadow. People noticed these small patterns, even if they never spoke of them. They became landmarks in time rather than space. The same sounds returned each night as well, footsteps echoing upward, a voice calling from below the quiet shifting of wood as buildings settled into the dark, and these sounds wrapped themselves around the body, uneven and imperfect, but known. Paris did not comfort through quiet. Quiet when it arrived felt unsettling. Instead, the city comforted through repetition, through the assurance that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be survived, that the stairs would still creak, the bells would still ring, and the city would still know how to continue, even if no one could explain how. As Paris settled into its uneven rest bodies, adjusted to the closeness of shared rooms, to the noise that became background rhythm, to the heavy air carrying the traces of many lives rising and falling together in slow, imperfect synchrony. Sleep did not come as escape nor as departure from reality, but as pause, a temporary loosening of effort before the city began again. Some slept lightly, some deeply from exhaustion. Others lay awake, listening, measuring the night by sound rather than sight. And somewhere high above the street, beneath slanted roofs or pressed close to it, behind thin walls, ordinary people closed their eyes without imagining themselves as part of anything larger. They were simply enduring, night after night, day after day, unaware that this quiet repetition of waking, working, waiting, and resting was slowly shaping the future of the city itself. For now, there was only the present moment, the slow breathing of Paris in the dark, the subtle rise and fall of thousands of lives moving together, just enough. For now, Paris breathed, and so did they. Morning in 18th century Paris did not announce itself with precision. There were no alarm clocks ringing sharply through the dark, no synchronized moment when the city agreed that the day had begun. Instead, morning arrived gradually, unevenly, as light filtered into narrow streets and found its way through small, imperfect windows. For many, waking was not a choice, but a response. The body stirred when the room grew just bright enough to reveal its limits, when the sounds outside shifted from night to day, when rest had given all it could. People woke according to light, not time. There was no sharp division between night and morning, no single instant when sleep was expected to end. Instead, the body responded gradually, guided by the slow changes in the room itself. The first pale glow of dawn crept across the walls, faint and uncertain, touching the ceiling before it reached the floor, revealing familiar shapes only in fragments. It slipped through shutters left slightly open for air catching on rough wood and uneven plaster, announcing the day without sound. In the upper rooms, light arrived earlier. It entered more directly unfiltered by the street below, spreading thinly across small windows and bare floors. But it was often a colder light, carrying with it the chill of height and exposure. The roofs held little warmth, and the air in these rooms remained sharp long after sunrise. Waking there meant pulling closer to the body whatever layers had been used through the night, lingering a moment longer before movement began. On the ground floor, morning came later. Light had to find its way through narrow streets, crowded with shadows shaped by buildings that leaned too close and by movement that never fully stopped. It arrived in pieces broken by passing bodies, by carts rolling slowly over stone, by animals already at work. The glow that entered these rooms was softer, more diffuse, colored by dust and motion, carrying with it the sounds and smells of the street before the day had fully announced itself. Because of this, morning did not feel the same everywhere in Paris. The city did not wake as one body, but as many, each responding to its own conditions. A person high above the street might rise earlier, not by choice, but because light allowed no more rest. Someone below might sleep longer, not because they could afford to, but because darkness still lingered. Waking depended on where you lived, how high you climbed each night, and how closely the street pressed against your door. In this way, the architecture of the city quietly governed the rhythm of its people, teaching them to wake not by clocks or commands, but by the slow, uneven arrival of day itself. There was no single sound that began the day, but bells came close. Church bells marked the hours loosely, not with exactness, but with rhythm. They reminded the city that time was moving, even if few could say precisely how much had passed. People learned to measure the morning by habit, by the sound of shutters opening nearby, by the voices of vendors beginning to call, by the smell of bread warming somewhere close enough to reach the stairwell. Getting up was rarely leisurely. Space did not allow for lingering. In rooms shared by several bodies, movement had to be negotiated carefully. Someone rose quietly to avoid waking others. Someone else stayed still, waiting for a turn to move. Beds were folded away or pushed aside to make a space. The same area that held sleep now needed to hold preparation for the day ahead. Clothing was simple, layered for practicality rather than comfort, pulled on quickly, adjusted by feel rather than mirror. Water shaped the first tasks of the morning in ways that were felt long before they were understood. There was no tap to turn, no basin that filled itself while the mind wandered elsewhere. Water had to be fetched, carried, or carefully saved from the day before, each drop already assigned a purpose before the day had properly begun. Buckets stood waiting in corners of the room, their weight known even before they were lifted, their rough handles familiar to the hands that gripped them each morning. A trip to the fountain was never a simple errand. It meant stairs first steep, uneven, already busy with other bodies beginning their descent. It meant joining a slow-moving line standing among neighbors and strangers alike, all measuring the morning by how long it took to reach the front. The sound of water striking stone echoed softly, steady and unhurried, indifferent to the urgency of those waiting. Time stretched in these moments, not because it moved slowly, but because there was so much of it demanded at once. For those who lived higher, every decision involving water was calculated. Each trip down meant a climb back up, and that climb carried its own cost. Burning muscles shortened breath, the careful balance required to keep heavy buckets from spilling. Water was never taken lightly. It was used sparingly, poured, deliberately shared when possible. Washing was limited. Cleaning was selective. Nothing was wasted without consequence. Even the choice of when to fetch water mattered. Too early, and the light was poor, the steps uncertain. Too late, and the crowds thickened, turning the task into a longer negotiation. In this way, water shaped not only the first actions of the day, but the rhythm of movement itself. It taught patience, restraint, and planning on a scale small enough to be lived moment by moment. Morning began not with thought or intention, but with weight of buckets of time of effort, and the quiet understanding that every action would be carried quite literally on the body. The street once outside felt immediately alive. Paris did not wake all at once, but it did wake early. Bakers were among the first working before dawn, so bread could be ready when the city began to stir. Their presence was announced not only by smell, but by lines forming bodies, gathering quietly, measuring the morning not by hours, but by availability. Bread was not a comfort food. It was the center of the day, the anchor around which everything else revolved. For ordinary people, the question was never what to eat, but whether there would be enough to last the day. Choice rarely entered the calculation. Meals were shaped by availability, not preference, by what could be afforded, rather than what was desired. Bread stood at the center of this concern, not as comfort, but as necessity. Its presence meant stability. Its absence unsettled everything else. Prices shifted without warning. They rose quietly, sometimes overnight, without explanation that reached those most affected. A bad harvest, somewhere beyond the city, too distant to be seen, too abstract to be verified, could ripple through Paris weeks later, appearing suddenly in the cost of a loaf. People felt these changes before they understood them. The body noticed first a lighter bag, a shorter portion, a longer line. Rumors moved faster than facts. A whisper passed from one queue to another, a comment exchanged on the stairs, a warning offered without certainty. Anxiety often arrived before confirmation, settling into the mind as a low, steady pressure. People learned to listen carefully, but not fully believe, to prepare without panicking, to carry concern without letting it stop them. Still mornings continued. The city did not wait for reassurance. You stood in line, shifting your weight from foot to foot, watching the door, counting loaves as they disappeared into other hands. You waited not idly, but attentively, measuring time by movement and possibility. If there was bread, you adjusted. If there was less than hoped, you adjusted again. Portions were divided differently. Meals were stretched. Hunger was managed rather than solved. The day did not pause for uncertainty. Work still demanded attention. Children still needed feeding. Stairs still had to be climbed. In this way, ordinary life absorbed instability into its rhythm. Concern became background noise, present, but not paralyzing. People learned to live with fluctuation, to wake each morning ready to respond rather than expect. And so the city moved forward, not because fear was absent, but because endurance had become familiar. Work began wherever work could be found. For some, it meant opening a shop directly onto the street, lifting shutters that had served as walls only hours before. For others, it meant walking sometimes long distances through the city to reach a place of labor. Paris was not small, and movement took time. Feet learned the streets, intimately stepping around puddles, avoiding obstacles, navigating crowds that thickened as the morning wore on. Children moved through this world alongside adults. There was no clear separation between childhood and labor. Many were already working, carrying items, assisting in shops, running errands. Their mornings mirrored those of their elders, shaped by necessity rather than choice. School for most was not part of the day. Learning happened through observation, repetition, and correction woven into work itself. As the sun rose higher, the city's sounds began to layer upon one another, not suddenly, but gradually, like threads being added to an already familiar weave. Voices overlapped in the streets below, vendors calling out their goods, neighbors exchanging brief remarks, instructions passed quickly from one person to another. Tools struck stone and wood in steady practiced rhythms, the sounds of labor settling into patterns that marked the progress of the morning more reliably than any clock. Carts creaked as they moved carefully over uneven ground wheels, finding the same grooves worn into the streets by years of repetition, while animals, horses, donkeys, sometimes cattle, made their way through spaces shared without clear boundaries between human and beast. The noise was constant, but it was not chaotic. It followed an order shaped by habit and necessity. Certain sounds belonged to certain hours, and people recognized them without conscious thought. A hammer at this time meant construction beginning. A familiar call meant a regular vendor had arrived. The rhythm of hooves signaled movement, not danger. Over time, the city taught its people how to listen. They learned to hear within the noise rather than against it. The ear became selective, trained to notice what mattered and release what did not. A shout directed at you cut through immediately. A child's voice carried differently. The rest, the endless background of movement and work, softened into something almost reassuring. Silence, when it came, felt more alarming than comfort. Attention shaped by need moved fluidly. You listened for opportunity, for warning, for familiarity. Everything else faded, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer demanded response. In this way, the sound of Paris became a kind of navigation, an invisible map that guided movement, signaled change, and reminded people that they were not alone in the effort of the day. The city spoke constantly, and those who lived within it learned quietly and patiently how to understand its language. Cleanliness, as we might understand it, was difficult to maintain. Without running water or modern sanitation, mornings included managing what the night had left behind. Waste was carried out sometimes discreetly, sometimes hastily. The city did not hide its byproducts. They existed alongside everything else, reminders of how closely bodies lived together. Smells shifted with the hour changing as activity increased, as sunlight warmed stone and stirred the air. And yet, despite the physical demands, mornings were not universally grim. There were moments of familiarity that softened the effort. A greeting exchanged on the stairs. A nod from someone seen every day at the same corner. The comfort of routine, even when the routine was hard. These small recognitions mattered. They stitched the city together more quietly than any official order. Time moved differently once the day was fully underway. Without clocks to govern every action, people worked until tasks were done, rather than until a specific hour arrived. The length of the morning stretched or contracted, depending on demand, on weather, on chance. Meals were taken when possible, not always when planned. Hunger was managed rather than eliminated. As midday approached, the light changed again, slipping into streets at new angles, revealing details missed earlier. Dust rose, stone warmed. The city adjusted just as it always did. Morning gave way, not with ceremony, but with continuation. For the ordinary people of Paris, the beginning of the day was not a moment to be seized or celebrated. It was something to enter carefully, step by step, guided by habit rather than hope. Each morning was an act of alignment between body and city, between need and possibility. And by the time the sun stood higher, the day was already in motion, carrying everyone forward, whether they were ready or not. In this way, Paris taught its people to wake not with anticipation, but with readiness, to accept the day as it arrived, shaped by forces larger than any single life, and to move within it with the quiet skill learned only through repetition. Morning in 18th century Paris did not announce itself with precision. There were no alarm clocks ringing sharply through the dark, no synchronized moment when the city agreed that the day had begun. Instead, morning arrived gradually unevenly, as light filtered into narrow streets and found its way through small, imperfect windows. For many, waking was not a choice, but a response. The body stirred when the room grew just bright enough to reveal its limits, when the sounds outside shifted from night to day, when rest had given all it could. People woke according to light, not time. There was no sharp division between night and morning, no single instant when sleep was expected to end. Instead, the body responded gradually, guided by the slow changes in the room itself. The first pale glow of dawn crept across the walls, faint and uncertain, touching the ceiling before it reached the floor, revealing familiar shapes only in fragments. It slipped through shutters, left slightly open for air catching on rough wood and uneven plaster, announcing the day without sound. In the upper rooms, light arrived earlier. It entered more directly, unfiltered by the street below, spreading thinly across small windows and bare floors. But it was often a colder light, carrying with it the chill of height and exposure. The roofs held little warmth, and the air in these rooms remained sharp long after sunrise. Waking there meant pulling closer to the body whatever layers had been used through the night, lingering a moment longer before movement began. On the ground floor, morning came later. Light had to find its way through narrow streets, crowded with shadows shaped by buildings that leaned too close and by movement that never fully stopped. It arrived in pieces broken by passing bodies, by carts rolling slowly over stone, by animals already at work. The glow that entered these rooms was softer, more diffuse, colored by dust and motion, carrying with it the sounds and smells of the street before the day had fully announced itself. Because of this, morning did not feel the same everywhere in Paris. The city did not wake as one body, but as many, each responding to its own conditions. A person high above the street might rise earlier, not by choice, but because light allowed no more rest. Someone below might sleep longer, not because they could afford to, but because darkness still lingered. Waking depended on where you lived, how high you climbed each night, and how closely the street pressed against your door. In this way, the architecture of the city quietly governed the rhythm of its people, teaching them to wake not by clocks or commands, but by the slow, uneven arrival of day itself. There was no single sound that began the day, but bells came close. Church bells marked the hours loosely, not with exactness, but with rhythm. They reminded the city that time was moving, even if few could say precisely how much had passed. People learned to measure the morning by habit, by the sound of shutters opening nearby, by the voices of vendors beginning to call, by the smell of bread warming somewhere close enough to reach the stairwell. Getting up was rarely leisurely. Space did not allow for lingering. In rooms shared by several bodies, movement had to be negotiated carefully. Someone rose quietly to avoid waking others. Someone else stayed still, waiting for a turn to move. Beds were folded away or pushed aside to make space. The same area that held sleep now needed to hold preparation for the day ahead. Clothing was simple, layered for practicality rather than comfort, pulled on quickly, adjusted by feel rather than mirror. Water shaped the first tasks of the morning in ways that were felt long before they were understood. There was no tap to turn, no basin that filled itself while the mind wandered elsewhere. Water had to be fetched, carried, or carefully saved from the day before, each drop already assigned a purpose before the day had properly begun. Buckets stood waiting in corners of the room, their weight known even before they were lifted, their rough handles familiar to the hands that gripped them each morning. A trip to the fountain was never a simple errand. It meant stairs first steep, uneven, already busy with other bodies beginning their descent. It meant joining a slow-moving line, standing among neighbors and strangers alike, all measuring the morning by how long it took to reach the front. The sound of water striking stone echoed softly, steady and unhurried, indifferent to the urgency of those waiting. Time stretched in these moments, not because it moved slowly, but because there was so much of it demanded at once. For those who lived higher, every decision involving water was calculated. Each trip down meant a climb back up, and that climb carried its own cost. Burning muscles, shortened breath, the careful balance required to keep heavy buckets from spilling. Water was never taken lightly. It was used sparingly, poured, deliberately shared when possible. Washing was limited. Cleaning was selective. Nothing was wasted without consequence. Even the choice of when to fetch water mattered. Too early and the light was poor, the steps uncertain. Too late and the crowds thickened, turning the task into a longer negotiation. In this way, water shaped not only the first actions of the day, but the rhythm of movement itself. It taught patience, restraint, and planning on a scale small enough to be lived moment by moment. Morning began not with thought or intention, but with weight of buckets of time, of effort, and the quiet understanding that every action would be carried quite literally on the body. The street once outside felt immediately alive. Paris did not wake all at once, but it did wake early. Bakers were among the first working before dawn, so bread could be ready when the city began to stir. Their presence was announced not only by smell, but by lines forming bodies, gathering quietly, measuring the morning not by hours, but by availability. Bread was not a comfort food. It was the center of the day, the anchor around which everything else revolved. For ordinary people, the question was never what to eat, but whether there would be enough to last the day. Choice rarely entered the calculation. Meals were shaped by availability, not preference, by what could be afforded rather than what was desired. Bread stood at the center of this concern, not as comfort, but as necessity. Its presence meant stability. Its absence unsettled everything else. Prices shifted without warning. They rose quietly, sometimes overnight, without explanation that reached those most affected. A bad harvest somewhere beyond the city, too distant to be seen, too abstract to be verified, could ripple through Paris weeks later, appearing suddenly in the cost of a loaf. People felt these changes before they understood them. The body noticed first a lighter bag, a shorter portion, a longer line. Rumors moved faster than facts. A whisper passed from one queue to another, a comment exchanged on the stairs, a warning offered without certainty. Anxiety often arrived before confirmation, settling into the mind as a low, steady pressure. People learned to listen carefully, but not fully believe, to prepare without panicking, to carry concern without letting it stop them. Still mornings continued. The city did not wait for reassurance. You stood in line, shifting your weight from foot to foot, watching the door, counting loaves as they disappeared into other hands. You waited not idly, but attentively, measuring time by movement and possibility. If there was bread, you adjusted. If there was less than hoped, you adjusted again. Portions were divided differently. Meals were stretched. Hunger was managed rather than solved. The day did not pause for uncertainty. Work still demanded attention. Children still needed feeding. Stairs still had to be climbed. In this way, ordinary life absorbed instability into its rhythm. Concern became background noise, present but not paralyzing. People learned to live with fluctuation, to wake each morning ready to respond rather than expect. And so the city moved forward, not because fear was absent, but because endurance had become familiar. Work began wherever work could be found. For some, it meant opening a shop directly onto the street, lifting shutters that had served as walls only hours before. For others, it meant walking sometimes long distances through the city to reach a place of labor. Paris was not small, and movement took time. Feet learned the streets, intimately stepping around puddles, avoiding obstacles, navigating crowds that thickened as the morning wore on. Children moved through this world alongside adults. There was no clear separation between childhood and labor. Many were already working, carrying items, assisting in shops, running errands. Their mornings mirrored those of their elders, shaped by necessity rather than choice. School, for most, was not part of the day. Learning happened through observation, repetition, and correction woven into work itself. As the sun rose higher, the city's sounds began to layer upon one another, not suddenly, but gradually, like threads being added to an already familiar weave. Voices overlapped in the streets below, vendors calling out their goods, neighbors exchanging brief remarks, instructions passed quickly from one person to another. Tools struck stone and wood in steady, practiced rhythms, the sounds of labor settling into patterns that marked the progress of the morning more reliably than any clock. Carts creaked as they moved carefully over uneven ground wheels, finding the same grooves worn into the streets by years of repetition, while animals, horses, donkeys, sometimes cattle, made their way through spaces shared without clear boundaries between human and beast. The noise was constant, but it was not chaotic. It followed an order shaped by habit and necessity. Certain sounds belonged to certain hours, and people recognized them without conscious thought. A hammer, at this time, meant construction beginning. A familiar call meant a regular vendor had arrived. The rhythm of hooves signaled movement, not danger. Over time, the city taught its people how to listen. They learned to hear within the noise rather than against it. The ear became selective, trained to notice what mattered and release what did not. A shout directed at you cut through immediately. A child's voice carried differently. The rest, the endless background of movement and work, softened into something almost reassuring. Silence, when it came, felt more alarming than comfort. Attention shaped by need moved fluidly. You listened for opportunity, for warning, for familiarity. Everything else faded, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer demanded response. In this way, the sound of Paris became a kind of navigation, an invisible map that guided movement, signaled change, and reminded people that they were not alone in the effort of the day. The city spoke constantly, and those who lived within it learned quietly and patiently how to understand its language. Cleanliness, as we might understand it, was difficult to maintain. Without running water or modern sanitation, mornings included managing what the night had left behind. Waste was carried out, sometimes discreetly, sometimes hastily. The city did not hide its byproducts. They existed alongside everything else, reminders of how closely bodies lived together. Smells shifted with the hour changing as activity increased, as sunlight warmed stone and stirred the air. And yet, despite the physical demands, mornings were not universally grim. There were moments of familiarity that softened the effort. A greeting exchanged on the stairs, a nod from someone seen every day at the same corner. The comfort of routine, even when the routine was hard. These small recognitions mattered. They stitched the city together more quietly than any official order. Time moved differently once the day was fully underway. Without clocks to govern every action, people worked until tasks were done, rather than until a specific hour arrived. The length of the morning stretched or contracted, depending on demand, on weather, on chance. Meals were taken when possible, not always when planned. Hunger was managed rather than eliminated. As midday approached, the light changed again, slipping into streets at new angles, revealing details missed earlier. Dust rose, stone warmed. The city adjusted just as it always did. Morning gave way, not with ceremony, but with continuation. For the ordinary people of Paris, the beginning of the day was not a moment to be seized or celebrated. It was something to enter carefully, step by step, guided by habit rather than hope. Each morning was an act of alignment between body and city, between need and possibility. And by the time the sun stood higher, the day was already in motion, carrying everyone forward, whether they were ready or not. In this way, Paris taught its people to wake not with anticipation, but with readiness. To accept the day as it arrived, shaped by forces larger than any single life, and to move within it with the quiet skill learned only through repetition. In 18th century Paris, work did not begin with ambition, nor did it end with satisfaction. It existed as a condition, something that framed the day from the moment the body rose until it finally lay down again. For ordinary people, labor was not a path toward advancement or fulfillment. It was the means by which tomorrow remained possible. Without it, everything else unraveled quickly. Work was everywhere because life itself required it, and there was no clear boundary where one ended and the other began. Shops opened directly onto the street, their doors wide, their interiors exposed, blurring the line between private space and public labor until the two became indistinguishable. What might appear from outside as a place of trade was in truth also a place of living. A single room could serve as workshop, storefront, and sleeping quarters, all at once shifting its purpose throughout the day without ceremony or pause. Tools lay where they were last used, not arranged carefully at the end of a shift, but kept close at hand, ready to be lifted again at a moment's notice. A hammer rested beside a bowl used for meals. Needles remained threaded on a table where bread had just been broken. The objects of work did not retreat when the day slowed. They remained present, silent reminders that labor could resume at any time. Space was too limited and time too valuable to allow for separation. Work spilled outward, naturally pressed by the narrowness of the rooms behind it. Doorways became extensions of workshops. Benches and tables crept into the street. Goods were displayed not behind glass, but within reach, inviting inspection, conversation, negotiation. Narrow alleys carried the sounds of labor deeper into the city, the scrape of metal, the rhythm of cutting and stitching, the dull thud of repeated effort. These sounds blended with footsteps and voices becoming part of the city's constant pulse. In this way, labor shaped the movement of Paris itself. Streets narrowed where work expanded. Paths curved around carts and tools left temporarily in place. The city adjusted to its workers, just as they adjusted to it. Life unfolded in full view, without partitions or privacy, and work became not something done apart from living, but the very texture of daily existence, woven so tightly into the environment that it could not be separated without unraveling everything else. There were artisans whose hands carried skill passed down not through words, but through years of repetition. Shoemakers, tailors, metalworkers, printers, people whose bodies remembered what the mind no longer needed to command. Their knowledge lived in muscle and posture, in the angle of a wrist, in the pressure applied without thought. Each movement had been practiced so many times that it flowed automatically, guided by habit rather than instruction. This skill was quiet and uncelebrated, visible only in the finished object and in the steadiness with which it was made. Their work required precision, but precision alone was not enough. It also demanded endurance. Hours stretched long, often without clear breaks, and attention had to be held steady across the entire span. A moment of distraction could undo an entire day's labor. Materials were not easily replaced. Leather, cloth, metal, paper all came at a cost that pressed heavily on those who used them. A miscut piece of leather or cloth was not simply a mistake. It was a loss measured in effort money and time already spent. There was rarely room for error and little forgiveness when it occurred. Because of this, concentration became a form of discipline. The body learned to work through fatigue, not by ignoring it, but by managing it carefully. Hands slowed slightly when tired. Movements became more deliberate. The rhythm adjusted just enough to prevent disaster. Fatigue was not eliminated. It was accommodated, folded into the work itself. Artisans learned how to recognize the limits of their own bodies, not to stop entirely, but to continue without crossing into failure. Over time, this balance shaped the worker as much as the craft. Shoulders rounded, fingers stiffened, eyes strained to maintain focus in poor light. Yet the work continued, carried forward by necessity and habit. Each finished piece represented not only skill, but restraint, the careful holding together of attention and effort across long hours. In this way, craft was less about inspiration than persistence, less about mastery than the quiet ability to keep going day after day without letting the work fall apart. Alongside these trades were forms of labor that left little trace behind. Porters carried loads from place to place, their work measured by weight and distance rather than craft. Washerwomen bent over water for hours, scrubbing fabric until fingers stiffened and skin cracked. Servants moved through other people's spaces, their presence essential but rarely acknowledged. Many lived where they worked their time belonging to someone else as much as to themselves. Workdays were long, often stretching 12 hours or more, not because anyone demanded such length explicitly, but because necessity left no alternative. Time was not divided neatly into segments marked by clocks or schedules. It flowed according to need, according to how much remained to be done, and how much strength was still available to do it. The day did not end when a certain hour arrived. It ended only when the body could no longer continue. There was no clear boundary between work and rest. One did not replace the other, so much as they blended together, overlapping in small, uneven intervals. Pauses were brief and rarely planned. They appeared only when the body insisted, when hands trembled slightly, when breath shortened, when focus threatened to slip. A moment to eat, taken standing or seated, wherever space allowed. A moment to drink water swallowed quickly rather than savored. A moment to breathe, leaning against a wall, eyes closing just long enough to steady the body again. Then movement resumed. Fatigue did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, layer by layer, settling into muscles and joints until it became familiar. Shoulders carried a constant weight. Knees stiffened when standing too long, protested when rising again. Hands ached not from injury, but from repetition. This weariness was not dramatic enough to demand attention. It was steady, persistent, and expected. Over time, it became part of the body's normal state. People learned to live within this condition. They adjusted posture pace and effort to accommodate what no longer faded overnight. Sleep restored enough to continue, but rarely enough to erase. Each morning began with a body already carrying yesterday's labor, and each evening added another layer. In this way, work did not simply fill the hours of the day. It reshaped the body itself, teaching it endurance through gradual, unrelenting use, until fatigue felt less like an interruption and more like the quiet background against which life unfolded. For those who labored outdoors, the city itself imposed additional demands. Streets were uneven, crowded, and unpredictable. Weather mattered. Rain turned ground to mud. Cold slowed fingers. Heat exhausted quickly. Work continued regardless. There were no protections against the elements beyond clothing already worn thin by use. Danger was a constant companion, though rarely named as such. Tools slipped, loads shifted, stairs misjudged led to falls. Injuries were common and often untreated. To be hurt was to risk losing not only health, but income. Many worked through pain adjusting movements to accommodate what no longer healed fully. The body adapted, but each adaptation carried a cost. Children worked alongside adults, learning labor not as instruction, but as participation. They carried, cleaned, assisted, watched closely. Their small bodies absorbed the same rhythms, the same expectations. There was little sense of preparation for a future career. Work was immediate. It belonged to the present day. Payment when it came was uncertain, never something that could be fully relied upon. Wages varied from day to day, from task to task, shaped by circumstances that lay beyond the worker's control. Some days brought enough to ease the weight of worry, while others delivered far less than expected. There was no steady rhythm to income, no promise that effort would be met with equal reward. Work existed, and payment followed only when conditions allowed. Work itself could disappear without warning. A shop closed quietly, shutters lowered, and never raised again. A patron moved on, taking their orders elsewhere without explanation. A change in fashion, a delay in supply, a shift in demand, any of these could erase a livelihood almost overnight. Illness too played its part. A few days unable to work could unravel weeks of careful balance. Without labor, there was no income, and without income, everything else grew uncertain. People learned to live without guarantees because there was no alternative. Irregular income became normal, something to be managed rather than corrected. Coins were counted carefully, not to measure abundance, but to judge how long they might last. Small expenses were weighed, larger ones postponed indefinitely. Saving while understood as wise was difficult to achieve in practice. What was earned often needed to be spent immediately absorbed by rent food and the costs of simply continuing. Planning beyond the near future felt impractical, almost indulgent. Tomorrow demanded attention before next week could be imagined. The mind stayed close to the present, focused on maintaining balance rather than building security. In this way, uncertainty shaped not only finances, but thought itself. People learned to expect fluctuation to adapt quickly, and to move forward without the reassurance of stability, carrying on with the quiet understanding that survival depended less on foresight than on resilience. And yet within this relentless structure, there was routine. Hands learned what to do without instruction. Movements repeated until they required little thought. In this way, work became almost meditative, not because it was peaceful, but because repetition offered predictability in a city otherwise full of uncertainty. The body remembered, even when the mind grew tired. Evening did not always bring an end. Work continued by candlelight when needed, especially during busy periods. The line between day and night blurred, shaped by demand rather than daylight. Only exhaustion imposed limits. Eventually, the body insisted on rest, even if the work remained unfinished. There was little celebration of labor, but also little expectation of escape from it. People did not speak often of fairness or injustice in abstract terms. They spoke of tiredness, of aching hands, of long days. Work was accepted as something endured collectively, not questioned individually. Still, the city depended on this quiet endurance more than it ever acknowledged. Paris moved because ordinary people moved within it, because countless small acts of labor accumulated into something larger than any one life. Every shoe repaired allowed someone else to walk another day. Every garment sewn kept a body warm, respectable, presentable enough to continue working. Every cart loaded and unloaded shifted goods from one corner of the city to another, sustaining a flow that never fully stopped. These tasks were small when viewed alone, but together they formed the pulse of the city itself. Ordinary labor kept Paris alive in ways that were invisible precisely because they were constant. There were no ceremonies to mark these efforts, no monuments raised to commemorate them. They existed in repetition in the reliability of services performed again and again without recognition. The city took this work for granted, even as it relied on it completely. At the same time, this labor consumed the bodies that performed it. Muscles wore down, joints stiffened, breath shortened over the years. The cost was paid slowly spread across decades rather than demanded all at once. Because of this, it was rarely named as sacrifice. Weariness became ordinary. Pain became familiar. Decline arrived quietly disguised as age rather than consequence. The paradox went unspoken. Few stopped to consider that the very effort sustaining the city was also eroding the lives within it. There was no space in daily thought for such reflection. To pause long enough to name the contradiction would have required distance from hunger, from need, from the immediate demands of the next day. People worked because they must not, because they believed it noble or just. They worked because stopping was unthinkable. Without labor, there was no income. Without income, no food. Without food, no tomorrow. In this way, endurance became not a virtue to be praised, but a condition quietly accepted, carried forward day after day, keeping the city in motion, even as it slowly took its toll. At night, when work finally released its hold, fatigue settled deeply. Sleep came quickly for many, heavy and uninterrupted. For others, pain delayed rest, keeping the mind close to the body's complaints. Tomorrow waited unchanged, regardless of how tired one felt. In this way, work shaped not only the hours of the day, but the expectations of life itself. It taught people to measure time by endurance, to accept weariness as normal, to find stability not in rest, but in continuation. The city did not pause to acknowledge this effort. It simply moved forward, carried by countless ordinary bodies that rose again each morning, ready or not to begin once more. In 18th century Paris, strength was not always loud, and endurance was rarely named. It did not arrive with declarations or visible triumphs. It existed quietly, almost invisibly, most clearly in the lives of women and children, whose labor and resilience shaped the city day after day, without ceremony and without expectation of recognition. Their effort did not draw attention to itself. It did not demand to be seen. It simply continued. Their work did not announce itself as work. It had no clear beginning and no formal end. It unfolded within households, along crowded streets, and in the narrow spaces between one task and the next. It appeared in the steady repetition of movements learned early and repeated often. Hands preparing food, lifting water, mending fabric, guiding smaller bodies through the day. These actions blended so completely into daily life that separating them from living itself felt impossible. Much of this labor took place behind doors or just beyond them, in spaces that were neither fully private nor fully public. A woman washing clothing at a fountain was both working and moving through the city. A child carrying an errand learned responsibility not through instruction, but through necessity. These efforts filled the gaps left by more visible forms of labor, holding households together quietly while the city moved around them. Because this work was constant, it became easy to overlook. Because it was essential, it was assumed. Endurance did not present itself as something extraordinary. It appeared instead as consistency, the ability to continue without pause, to adapt without complaint, to absorb strain without outward display. Over time, this quiet persistence shaped not only daily routines, but expectations themselves. Life was organized around what women and children could carry, manage, and sustain, even when their contribution went unnamed. In this way, the city was built not only by stone and trade, but by countless small acts repeated without acknowledgement. Strength lived in these repetitions, steady and unremarked, woven so tightly into the fabric of everyday life that it became indistinguishable from it. For women, the day did not begin after rest, because rest was rarely complete. Night faded into morning without a clear boundary, sleep loosening its hold, while responsibilities were already present, waiting quietly. Even before the body fully woke, the mind was aware of what remained to be done. There was no moment of empty stillness between one day and the next. Instead, tasks carried over uninterrupted from darkness into light. There was water to fetch before the household stirred too fully, before the lines at the fountain grew long. Food needed preparing with whatever was available, often planned the night before and adjusted again in the morning. Clothing worn thin by constant use required mending before it failed completely. Children needed guiding into motion, washed, fed if possible, directed toward work errands or simple tasks that filled their day. None of this waited to be announced. It unfolded as soon as the body was able to move. These tasks were not written down or arranged into a schedule. They did not belong to specific hours. They were understood, absorbed early in life, learned by watching and by doing, rather than by instruction. A girl learned what came next by observing what had always come next. Repetition replaced explanation. Over time, the sequence of the day settled into the body, becoming instinctive rather than deliberate. The household depended entirely on the completion of these tasks, yet they were seldom described as work in the same way other labor was. There was no wage attached, no clear boundary that marked when effort began or ended. Because these responsibilities were constant, they became invisible. Their success was measured only by absence, by the lack of disorder, hunger, or delay. When everything functioned as it should, nothing appeared remarkable. They were simply expected. To fulfill them was not seen as contribution, but as duty. To fall behind, even briefly, carried immediate consequences. And so, the day moved forward, not from a place of rest, but from continuation, built upon the quiet understanding that what had sustained the household yesterday would need to be sustained again today, without pause and without acknowledgement. Many women worked for wages in addition to managing their own homes. Some took in laundry scrubbing and wringing heavy fabric until hands stiffened and skin cracked. Others sewed garments for shops or private customers, stitching by poor light for hours at a time. Some sold goods on the street, small items carried in baskets, their voices joining the city's constant murmur. These forms of labor were flexible in appearance, but demanding in practice, requiring long hours and offering little security. Pregnancy did not remove women from work. It reshaped it. Bodies adjusted, movement slowed slightly, effort redistributed. Rest was limited, often postponed. Childbirth carried risk that was widely understood but rarely discussed. Many women returned to work quickly, necessity leaving little room for recovery. Care for infants was folded into the day's rhythm rather than set apart from it. Children moved within this world naturally, not as observers standing at the edge of adult life, but as participants already woven into its rhythm. There was no clear moment when childhood ended, and work began, no ceremony or decision that marked the transition. For many, work was simply part of growing up, present from the earliest years as something ordinary and expected. Life did not pause to allow childhood to exist separately. It unfolded, and children unfolded within it. Small bodies were given small tasks at first light loads, to carry short errands, to run simple assistance offered in shops or homes. These duties were scaled not to teach, but to be useful. A child fetched water because water was needed. A child delivered a message because time mattered. Through repetition, responsibility became familiar long before it was understood as such. Strength grew quietly, not only in muscle, but in awareness of what others depended on. Much of this learning happened without words. Children watched closely, their attention drawn to movement rather than explanation. They learned how to hold an object by observing how it was held. They learned timing by noticing when a task was done, not when it was assigned. Correction came through example more often than instruction. Over time, imitation turned into habit, and habit into skill. Tasks were not presented as lessons or opportunities for development. They were needs that had to be met. The logic was simple and unquestioned. You did what needed to be done, because it needed doing. There was little room for hesitation or refusal. Contribution was expected, not as achievement, but as belonging. To help was to be part of the household, part of the street, part of the city itself. In this way, children learned endurance early. They learned to move with purpose, to notice what was missing, to respond without being asked. Childhood did not disappear, but it took a different shape, one defined less by protection and more by participation. Growing up meant becoming useful, step by step, task by task, until work no longer felt like something added to life, but something inseparable from it. Education in the formal sense was limited. Reading and writing were skills some acquired often through church or informal instruction, but for many, learning came through repetition and correction. Hands learned before minds could name what they were doing. Children absorbed the rhythms of labor, early understanding, effort, patience, and restraint through daily practice rather than explanation. Meals reflected this shared labor. Children ate alongside adults, not separately, and not by design. Hunger did not distinguish between ages. When food was scarce, everyone felt it. portions were adjusted quietly. Mothers learned to distribute food without drawing attention to imbalance, breaking bread carefully, ladling soup with precision. Fathers ate quickly, aware that strength was needed for the next day's work. No one lingered unless there was reason to believe there would be enough later. Illness affected women and children differently, but no less seriously. Care was given within the household, using knowledge passed down through experience rather than formal training. Remedies were improvised, rest taken when possible. A sick child altered the rhythm of the entire household. A sick mother threatened its stability. Yet medical assistance was limited and often expensive. Many endured quietly, trusting time and resilience more than intervention. Emotion, too, was managed carefully, shaped by necessity rather than choice. There was little space in daily life for open expressions of fear or exhaustion, not because these feelings were absent, but because there was nowhere to place them safely. The day demanded continuation. Tasks waited regardless of how one felt, and so emotion was folded inward, carried quietly alongside physical effort, regulated with the same restraint. Worry existed constantly, but it rarely announced itself. It lived beneath conversation, beneath movement, beneath routine. Women learned early how to contain it, how to keep their faces steady, even when resources were thin and outcomes uncertain. Order had to be maintained not only in the household, but in tone and gesture. A calm exterior made the day easier to manage. Panic, once visible, could spread quickly, unsettling children, disrupting rhythm, making scarcity feel sharper than it already was. Children absorbed this emotional discipline without instruction. They learned by watching. They noticed when voices lowered, when movements slowed, when certain topics were avoided. They learned when not to ask questions. Adaptation became instinctive. Constraints were accepted as normal, not because they were understood, but because they were consistent. When something was missing, life adjusted around it. When disappointment arrived, it passed without ceremony. In this way, emotional endurance mirrored physical endurance. Just as bodies learned to carry fatigue without stopping, minds learned to hold uncertainty without naming it. Feelings were not denied, but they were compressed, made smaller, so that the day could continue. Over time, this shaping happened before language could intervene. Responses to uncertainty, formed through experience rather than explanation, embedded quietly in habit and expectation. By the time words might have been available to describe fear or exhaustion, the ability to endure them had already been learned. Emotion, like labor, became something to be managed privately, carried forward without display. And in this quiet management, resilience took root not as a concept to be praised, but as a way of existing that allowed life, however constrained, to keep moving. Work for women and children often went unpaid or underpaid. Its value was measured indirectly in meals, prepared garments, repaired days made possible. Because it was essential and constant, it became invisible. The city relied on this labor without acknowledging it, its systems built quietly upon it. As evening arrived, responsibilities did not vanish. Clothing was prepared for the next day. Food was portioned carefully. Children were guided toward sleep, sometimes before hunger was fully satisfied. Women's days ended later than they began, often after others had rested. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by need, by noise, by awareness of what awaited the morning. And yet within this demanding structure, there were moments of connection. A shared task completed. A child learning something new. A brief pause where laughter slipped in unexpectedly. These moments were not frequent, but they mattered. They softened the edges of endurance, reminding those within the household that life consisted of more than effort alone. The city did not record these lives carefully. It had little reason to. Names were written down only when necessary, and often only once at birth, at marriage, at death. Many slipped through even those narrow records. Stories were not preserved. They faded quietly, carried for a time in memory, and then released, leaving little trace behind. What endured was not the individual, but the result of their effort. What remained was the effect of their labor, embedded so deeply in the daily functioning of Paris that it became almost invisible. Clean clothing appeared each morning, ready to be worn. Meals were prepared and portioned without ceremony. Workers arrived fed enough to continue. Children were guided, corrected, carried forward into the rhythm of the day. None of this announced itself. It simply happened again and again, as if by habit rather than human effort. These quiet acts sustained the city just as surely as any visible trade or public work. Without them, nothing else could proceed. Shops would falter, labor would weaken, streets would lose their rhythm. Yet because this labor was constant, it escaped notice. Success was measured by absence, by the lack of disorder, the lack of interruption. When everything worked, there was nothing to remark upon. The city moved forward on this foundation of unrecorded lives. It depended on hands that would never be named, on decisions made quietly within households, on endurance that left no monument behind. History remembered outcomes, not processes, structures, not maintenance. But beneath every visible function lay these unseen efforts, repeated daily, sustaining Paris in ways that could not be counted, only felt. And so these lives passed without inscription, their presence marked only by continuity. The city remained clean enough, fed enough, ordered enough to continue. That was their legacy, not written in ink or stone, but woven into the ordinary persistence of life itself. Women and children carried a weight that rarely appeared in public accounts, yet without it the city's rhythm would have faltered. Their endurance did not seek recognition, it sought continuation. And so day after day, within rooms too small and lives too full, they worked, adapted, and endured, shaping the city not through proclamation, but through persistence. In 18th century Paris, illness was not an interruption to ordinary life. It did not arrive as a sudden break in routine demanding attention and rearrangement. Instead, it hovered close, always present, at the edge of awareness, expected rather than feared. Sickness was woven into daily existence with the same familiarity as fatigue or hunger, another condition to be managed rather than overcome. People did not speak of health as something stable or secure. The body was understood as temporary, by nature vulnerable to forces that lay largely beyond control. Weather could weaken it, slowly damp and cold settling into joints and lungs. Work could wear it down through repetition and strain. Water drawn from uncertain sources carried risks that were accepted without full understanding. Chance itself played a role in encounter, a crowded room, a passing illness that moved silently from one body to another. These influences were not named scientifically, but they were felt, recognized through experience rather than explanation. Sickness often arrived quietly. A cough lingered longer than expected. A fever rose overnight without warning. Weakness appeared where strength had been the day before. There was rarely a clear moment when illness could be identified as having begun. It simply became part of the day, folded into movement and effort, accommodated as long as possible. And when it departed, it did so just as unpredictably, sometimes fading gradually sometimes lifting suddenly, and sometimes not leaving at all. Because of this uncertainty, people learned not to rely on the idea of recovery. They relied instead on endurance. The body was treated as something that could falter at any time, and life was arranged accordingly. Health was not assumed. It was negotiated daily, balanced carefully against work obligation and necessity. In this way, illness shaped behavior even when it was not present, reminding people quietly and persistently that stability was fragile and continuation depended less on strength than on adaptation. The city itself made illness difficult to avoid. Crowded rooms shared air, narrow streets, and limited sanitation allowed disease to move easily from one body to another. Water carried risks that were poorly understood. Waste lingered. Animals passed through spaces meant for people. These conditions were not questioned. They were simply the environment in which life unfolded, accepted as inevitable rather than preventable. For ordinary people, sickness rarely meant complete rest. To be ill did not excuse one from responsibility. It altered the rhythm of the day, slowed movement, reduced strength, but work continued as long as the body could be made to comply. A cough was endured. Fever was worked through. Pain was accommodated rather than treated. Only when movement became impossible did rest truly begin, and even then it was uneasy. Care took place within the household, not as a specialized practice, but as an extension of daily life itself. When illness appeared, it was absorbed into the rhythm of the home rather than set apart from it. Knowledge passed quietly between generations, not through formal study or written instruction, but through observation memory and repetition. What to do had been learned long before it needed to be named. A mother knew what her own mother had done. A child watched closely, storing these actions away for a time when they would be needed again. Remedies were simple because simplicity was all that was available. Warmth mattered. Extra layers were added. Fires tended more carefully. Bodies positioned to conserve heat. Fluids were offered when they could be spared, carried patiently sip by sip. Herbs were gathered or purchased when possible, familiar plants whose effects were known through use rather than explanation. Compresses were applied with care cloths, warmed or cooled as needed, changed quietly through the night. Rest was encouraged when it could be allowed, though it was often partial and interrupted. Hands became instruments of understanding. They learned to feel for heat along the skin, to recognize when warmth signaled danger rather than comfort. Fingers rested briefly at the wrist or the neck, measuring the rhythm of breath and pulse without counting. Ears listened closely in the dark, attuned to changes in breathing that might signal improvement or decline. Sight, touch, and sound worked together, forming judgments that were never spoken aloud, but deeply trusted. There was little certainty in this care. Outcomes were unpredictable, and explanations were incomplete. Yet there was attention steady, focused, and patient. Care did not promise cure. It offered presence. It meant staying close, adjusting small details, responding to changes as they appeared. In a world where control was limited, this attentiveness mattered. It was how families resisted helplessness, not by mastering illness, but by meeting it quietly with whatever knowledge and steadiness they possessed. Medical professionals existed, but they were not easily accessed. Doctors were expensive and often reserved for those with means. For the poor, hospitals were places of last resort rather than healing. To enter one was to accept uncertainty of a different kind. Beds were shared. Conditions were crowded. Recovery was not guaranteed. Many delayed seeking help as long as they could, weighing the risk of treatment against the risk of staying home. Women carried much of the burden of care not by assignment, but by inevitability. When illness entered a household, it settled most heavily into their days and nights, reshaping time without asking permission. They watched children through the long hours of darkness, waking at the smallest change in breath or movement, listening closely while the rest of the household slept. Night offered little relief. It became another stretch of attention, measured in moments of quiet vigilance rather than rest. During the day, care was threaded between other tasks rather than replacing them. A woman tended to the sick while preparing food, while fetching water, while mending clothing that could not wait. Routines were adjusted carefully to accommodate weakness meals, delayed work, slowed movements, softened, yet nothing could stop entirely. The household still needed to function. Children still needed guidance. The city outside still demanded engagement. Care unfolded in fragments fitted into the narrow spaces between obligations. As illness lingered, days grew longer. Time expanded, not because there was more of it, but because it was filled more densely. Nights grew shorter, broken into intervals of watchfulness. Sleep came lightly, if at all, always provisional. The body learned to rest without fully releasing attention alert, even in exhaustion. Fatigue accumulated quietly, carried forward rather than resolved. Care was not separated from labor. It was folded into it, inseparable from the effort that sustained daily life. There was no clear moment when caregiving began or ended. It moved alongside work, overlapping with it, adding weight without replacing responsibility. Because of this, it often went unnamed, understood as duty rather than contribution. Emotional steadiness mattered as much as physical effort. Fear had to be contained so that others could endure. A calm voice reassured children. Steady hands prevented panic from spreading. Worry was held inward, not because it was absent, but because displaying it would have unsettled those who depended on stability. In this quiet management of emotion, women protected not only bodies, but the fragile balance of the household itself, carrying the strain silently so that life, however precarious, could continue. Children experienced illness early and often. Many did not survive it. The city understood this without ceremony. Death in childhood was common enough to be expected, though never welcomed. Families mourned briefly, often privately, because life demanded continuation. There were other children to feed, other tasks waiting. Grief did not disappear, but it learned to coexist with necessity. Death itself was not distant. It was visible, present in the rhythm of the city. Bells announced it. Processions passed through streets. Cemeteries lay close to homes. People learned to live alongside the knowledge that life could end suddenly without reason or warning. This awareness shaped behavior, subtly encouraging caution without allowing paralysis. When death arrived, it was rarely dramatic. It did not announce itself with spectacle or final words. More often, it came quietly following a period of illness or long exhaustion, slipping into the household as gently as sleep. Many died at home in the same rooms where they had worked, eaten, rested, and endured. There was no sharp division between living space and dying space. The transition was gradual, almost understated, marked more by absence than by event. Bodies were prepared not by professionals, but by family members or neighbors who knew what needed to be done. Hands that had once offered care now moved with practiced calm, washing, and arranging performing tasks learned through repetition rather than instruction. These acts were carried out with respect, but without ceremony beyond what custom allowed. There was little room for elaboration. Means were limited, and simplicity was both necessity and habit. Rituals followed patterns shaped by tradition and circumstance. Prayers were spoken if they could be gestures made that connected the moment to others that had come before. Yet everything remained restrained. Mourning did not unfold loudly or at length. Grief existed, but it was compressed, carried inward, rather than displayed. The household could not afford to stop. Responsibilities remained. Food still needed preparing. Work still waited. There was little space for prolonged mourning because time itself did not pause. The city moved forward with its usual momentum, indifferent to individual loss. Bells rang, processions passed, and then the streets filled again. Those left behind were carried along with this movement, their sorrow folded into daily routine. Loss became another weight to manage, another condition to endure quietly. In this way, death was not set apart from life, but absorbed into it. It marked an ending without offering closure. What remained was continuity, the household adjusting the street, resuming its rhythm, the city continuing on its course. And those who survived learned, as they had learned so many other things, how to carry absence without letting it stop them from moving forward. Fear of death existed, but it was not constant. Familiarity dulled its edge. People did not dwell on it unnecessarily. Instead, they focused on maintaining balance, keeping illness from spreading, caring for those who could recover, accepting loss when it occurred. In this way, mortality became another condition to be managed, rather than an event to be confronted directly. Even so, illness reshaped lives. A lingering weakness could alter a person's ability to work. An injury that failed to heal fully might reduce income permanently. These changes rippled outward, affecting households and dependents. The consequences of sickness extended beyond the body, touching every aspect of daily life. The city did not provide safety nets in the modern sense. Support came from family, neighbors, and informal networks. Assistance was offered when possible, withheld when not. Generosity existed, but it was limited by scarcity. People helped one another not because they believed hardship was unjust, but because they recognized it as shared. At night, illness felt heavier. Pain intensified. Breathing grew more noticeable. Sleep came in fragments. Caregivers listened in the dark, alert to changes, measuring time by breath and movement rather than hours. The city outside continued its low murmur, indifferent to individual suffering, yet shaped by it in aggregate. And still life continued. Many recovered. Bodies adapted. Strength returned enough to resume work. Illness passed into memory, becoming another story folded into the quiet narrative of endurance. Those who survived carried forward an altered awareness of fragility, often without words to express it. In this way, sickness and death did not halt the city. They moved within it, shaping routines, expectations, and responses. Ordinary people learned to live close to vulnerability without letting it define them entirely. They accepted uncertainty as part of existence, managing it with the same restraint and repetition that governed every other aspect of life. The presence of illness taught the city humility. It reminded people that control was limited, that effort did not always yield outcome. Yet it also revealed resilience, quiet, persistent, uncelebrated. Care continued. Work resumed. Children grew. The city endured, carried forward by those who learned how to live and sometimes die within its narrow margins. In 18th century Paris, rest was not something that arrived freely or predictably. It was not granted by schedule or protected by custom. It had to be found, often unexpectedly, and carved carefully out of the day in small, fragile moments that could disappear as quickly as they appeared. Rest was not announced. It was taken quietly whenever the rhythm of labor loosened just enough to allow it. For ordinary people, leisure was not a separate category of life, clearly defined and set apart from work. It did not wait patiently at the end of the day because the day itself rarely ended cleanly. Work bled into evening and evening into night without firm boundaries. Even when hands stopped moving, responsibilities often remained close ready to return at the slightest demand. There was no clear signal that it was time to rest, only an awareness that the body could no longer continue at the same pace. Instead, relief appeared in brief pauses, moments so small they might be overlooked if not needed. A few minutes seated on a step, letting the legs recover. A pause at a doorway watching the street pass by without needing to join it. A shared silence between tasks where no words were required and no effort was asked for. These moments were not indulgences. They were necessities taken without ceremony. Shared rituals offered another form of rest. Familiar gestures repeated daily or weekly allowed the mind to relax even when the body remained alert. A bell heard at the same hour, a prayer spoken without concentration, a greeting exchanged with someone known. These repetitions carried reassurance. They reminded people that not everything required decision or effort. In these brief intervals, the weight of necessity loosened just enough to allow breath to deepen. Shoulders lowered, movement slowed. For a moment, the body remembered what it felt like not to be driven forward. The relief was never complete and never long-lasting, but it was enough. Enough to steady the body enough, to continue enough to face what remained of the day without breaking. Rest in this way was not escape. It was survival, practiced quietly in the narrow spaces between obligations. Religion provided one of the most consistent structures for these pauses. Churches were not only places of belief, but places of rhythm. Bells marked time more reliably than any other signal in the city, calling people not only to prayer, but to a shared sense of order. For many, attending church was less about doctrine than about familiarity. The rituals were known, repeated week after week, offering continuity in a life otherwise shaped by uncertainty. Inside these spaces, the city felt different, as though it had stepped back and lowered its voice. Stone walls absorbed sound that would otherwise echo sharply through narrow streets, softening footsteps, dulling the murmur of voices, allowing silence to exist without feeling empty. The air itself seemed heavier, steadier, less hurried. Movement slowed almost instinctively, not because it was required, but because the space encouraged it. Bodies stood or knelt close together, separated by little more than habit and posture. Here, proximity did not feel crowded in the way the streets did. People were united not by status or occupation, but by shared routine. The gestures were familiar: hands, folded heads, bowed eyes lowered, not as displays of devotion, but as motions learned through repetition. These movements required no decision. The body knew what to do. Prayer demanded stillness, and stillness itself carried comfort. To remain unmoving even briefly was rare elsewhere in the city. Here it was expected. Muscles that had worked continuously were allowed to pause. Breathing slowed. The weight of the body settled evenly, no longer pulled forward by urgency. Attention usually scattered among tasks and concerns gathered inward. For a brief time, thought shifted away from hunger, fatigue, and worry. These concerns did not vanish, but they loosened their grip. The mind rested not through distraction, but through quiet. The body rested even if only by standing or kneeling without demand, held in place by stone and ritual rather than effort. In these moments, relief came not from change, but from suspension. Life outside continued, but it felt distant, softened by walls and custom. When people eventually moved again, they carried this small easing with them, subtle, but real enough to steady them as they returned to the crowded streets and the weight of the day ahead. Religion also shaped the calendar. Feast days, saints' days, and holy observances broke the monotony of labor. They offered permission to pause, to gather, to notice the passage of time beyond survival. Even those who questioned belief often respected these moments. They were part of the city's structure, woven into its life as firmly as work itself. Outside religious spaces, entertainment emerged wherever space and circumstance allowed. It was not planned far in advance, nor carefully contained. It appeared suddenly, filling streets and squares with sound and movement, transforming familiar routes into places of temporary spectacle. Areas once shaped by work and passage became stages, if only for a short while, and the city responded almost immediately, gathering around what broke the pattern of the day. During fairs and festivals, the rhythm of Paris shifted. Music carried farther than usual, cutting through the ordinary noise of labor. Performers appeared without warning, musicians drawing crowds with repetitive melodies, acrobats bending their bodies into improbable shapes, storytellers holding attention with familiar tales reshaped slightly for each audience. These figures did not promise escape from daily life. They offered something smaller and more attainable distraction. The performances were brief and imperfect. Crowds formed unevenly, pressing close, then dispersing just as quickly. Children moved forward eagerly. Adults lingered at the edges, watching when time allowed. Coins were offered, sparingly applause, more common than payment. No one expected these moments to last. Their value lay precisely in their impermanence. These events did not erase hardship. Hunger returned. Work resumed. Worry waited patiently. Yet they altered the texture of the day in ways that mattered. Laughter rose where silence had settled too heavily. Attention lifted even briefly away from calculation and effort. The body responded before the mind could question it. Shoulders relaxed, faces softened, breath deepened. For a short time, people were reminded that life contained more than endurance alone. The city felt lighter, less compressed, as though the weight it carried had shifted slightly. When the crowd eventually thinned and the performers moved on, what remained was not a solution, but a memory. A moment when the day bent rather than pressed forward relentlessly. Laughter, even brief, mattered. It did not change circumstances, but it changed how they were carried. And in a city where relief was rare and demands constant, these small interruptions offered balance, fragile, fleeting, but deeply necessary. Songs traveled easily through Paris. They required no stage and no permission. Workers sang while laboring vendors called out in rhythmic phrases that blurred into music. Children repeated melodies learned by ear. Songs carried humor, complaint memory. They allowed emotion to surface safely wrapped in familiar tunes. In this way, sound became a form of shared relief. Conversation itself was a kind of entertainment, one that required no stage, no payment, and no permission. It emerged naturally in the spaces where people already passed one another, doorways, where a pause was unavoidable, stairwells, where footsteps slowed, fountains, where waiting created opportunity. Words were exchanged casually at first, then lingered, forming small islands of connection within the larger current of the day. People spoke of what they had seen, what they had heard, what they believed might be happening elsewhere in the city. News traveled this way, carried not by official notice, but by repetition. A detail picked up at a market reappeared on a stair. A rumor overheard in a shop was reshaped slightly before reaching the next listener. In this movement, stories expanded beyond immediate experience, connecting individuals to a wider world they might never otherwise encounter. Gossip played a central role in this exchange. It was not valued for accuracy so much as for presence. Not all of it was true, and few expected it to be. Truth was not always the point. What mattered was participation. The act of listening and responding, of being momentarily drawn out of one's own concerns and into something shared. Speculation filled the spaces where certainty was unavailable, offering meaning when facts were scarce. These conversations did not demand long attention. They rose and fell with circumstance ending as suddenly as they began when work resumed or movement was required. Yet even brief exchanges mattered. They broke the isolation of labor, reminding people that they existed within a network of voices and lives beyond their own households. In this way, conversation filled the gaps left by work. It provided engagement without obligation, connection without cost. It allowed the mind to wander briefly to rest from calculation and effort. In a city shaped by necessity, these moments of shared speech offered relief not by changing reality, but by softening its weight one exchanged word at a time. Cafes where they existed played a growing role in this social life, though they remained inaccessible to many. For those who could enter, they offered warmth conversation and the possibility of listening rather than doing. Ideas circulated here, political, philosophical, practical, often filtered through humor or skepticism. These spaces allowed thought to wander, even if only briefly. For most people, however, relaxation remained informal and unremarkable, so woven into routine that it was rarely recognized as rest at all. A shared drink of water passed from hand to hand without comment. A moment seated on a stone step, letting the legs recover before rising again. A pause to watch the street pass by, faces moving through light and shadow carts, rolling past familiar sounds, returning in their usual order. These moments were not planned. They were taken quietly whenever the body insisted. They were not indulgences. No one treated them as rewards or luxuries. They were necessities disguised as habits, folded into the day so naturally that their importance was easy to overlook. The body required these pauses, even when the mind dismissed them as trivial. Muscles needed stillness. Breath needed space. Without these small interruptions, fatigue would have accumulated, too quickly pressing down until movement itself became difficult. Children, meanwhile, found play in the same spaces where adults worked, without needing to separate one from the other. Games emerged spontaneously, shaped by what was close at hand: a loose stone, a length of string, a shared joke, a stretch of open ground between carts. There was no clear beginning or end to play. It arose in moments when attention drifted away from responsibility and faded again when needed elsewhere. Laughter surfaced easily among children, light and sudden, unburdened by the same calculations that shaped adult rest. They did not measure time against tomorrow's demands or weigh pleasure against necessity. Play was immediate, responsive to circumstance rather than protected from it. It adapted, quickly shrinking or expanding as space and supervision allowed. Play did not interrupt life. It existed within it, threaded through work and movement, appearing wherever there was room. In this way, children learned early how to find relief without escape, how to shape joy from what was available rather than waiting for ideal conditions. Their laughter moved through the city, briefly rising and fading like sound itself, offering a reminder soft but persistent that even within constraint, life still found ways to loosen its grip, if only for a moment. At night, when work slowed and light dimmed, the city softened. Conversations grew quieter. Movement slowed. Some gathered to talk, others to listen. Stories were told, repeated, altered, slightly each time. These narratives connected people across days and years, offering meaning without demanding explanation. Even superstition played a role in this landscape of belief and relief. Small rituals, charms, and sayings provided reassurance when certainty was scarce. They did not replace religion, but complemented it, filling gaps where explanation failed. These practices offered control in a world where control was limited. Importantly, these moments of relief did not erase hardship. They did not resolve hunger or fatigue, but they altered how hardship was experienced. They reminded people that life consisted of more than endurance alone, that there were moments, however small, when effort eased and attention could rest. The city depended on these pauses as much as it depended on labor. Without them, exhaustion would have overwhelmed even the most resilient bodies. Relief was not luxury, it was maintenance. It kept people moving forward without breaking entirely. In this way, entertainment, belief, and social connection formed a quiet network of support. They did not challenge the structure of life, but they softened its edges. They offered balance rather than escape, continuity rather than disruption. As night deepened and voices faded, these small moments settled into memory. They were not recorded or celebrated, but they mattered. They allowed people to carry the weight of the next day with slightly steadier hands. And so, within a crowded city shaped by work and uncertainty, these fragile spaces of rest helped ordinary people endure one pause at a time. As night settled over 18th century Paris, the city did not fall silent all at once. Darkness arrived, gradually folding itself into streets and rooms with practiced familiarity. Light faded unevenly, shaped by narrow alleys, tall buildings, and the last glow of windows that remained open just a little longer. The day loosened its grip, slowly releasing people not into rest, but into a different rhythm of endurance. For ordinary people, night was not a reward earned at the end of effort. It was a necessity accepted without ceremony, an interval in which the body could recover just enough to begin again. Sleep was not approached with anticipation or comfort in mind. It was taken because it had to be taken, because without it, the following day would be impossible. Sleep was rarely deep or uninterrupted. It arrived in layers uneven and fragile, shaped by the world that continued to move around the sleeper. Noise filtered through walls too thin to stop it completely. Footsteps passed in the street below. Voices rose and fell. Someone shifted nearby and the body adjusted instinctively, half awake even while resting. Shared space meant shared rhythm. Rest was negotiated silently through habit rather than expectation. There was always an awareness that morning would arrive whether one was ready or not. This knowledge lingered at the edge of sleep, preventing complete surrender. The body rested, but it did not abandon alertness entirely. Responsibility pressed lightly, even in darkness, reminding the sleeper that rest was temporary, provisional, and finite. Still, the body accepted what it could. Muscles loosened gradually. Breathing slowed. Fatigue did much of the work that comfort could not. There was no expectation of softness, warmth, or privacy. Blankets were thin, surfaces were hard. positions were chosen for necessity rather than ease. And yet rest came. In this way, sleep was not a retreat from life, but another form of endurance. It offered maintenance rather than renewal, enough stillness to continue, enough quiet to restore balance without excess. The body did not demand more than it was accustomed to receiving. It settled into rest as it settled into everything else, with restraint, adaptation, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow would ask again. Rooms filled quickly at night. Families gathered into the same limited spaces they had occupied all day, now reshaped by darkness. Beds, when they existed, were shared. More often, pallets were laid out, blankets spread where there was room. Privacy was rare. Bodies adjusted to closeness, to the warmth and movement of others, learning how to rest without withdrawing entirely. Sleep was collective, negotiated silently through position and habit. The city continued to breathe around them. Sounds carried differently at night. Footsteps echoed more clearly. Voices traveled farther. Distant carts creaked through streets that never fully emptied. Animals shifted. Bells marked hours that few counted precisely. For those half awake, these sounds were not disturbances, but signals of continuity. The city was still there. Life had not stopped. Exhaustion did much of the work that comfort could not. It guided the body into stillness with a firmness born not of kindness or ease, but of necessity. After long days of movement and effort, the body no longer debated whether to rest. It yielded. Once movement was no longer required, bodies worn down by repetition settled quickly, as if gravity itself had grown stronger. Muscles released into quiet the moment permission was granted, letting go without ceremony or hesitation. There was little resistance because there was little strength left for it. Fatigue stripped away excess thought, smoothing the sharp edges of awareness until decisions felt unnecessary. The mind did not search for softness or reassurance. It accepted rest as it accepted everything else without expectation. In this state, the absence of comfort no longer mattered. What mattered was stillness. Fatigue softened the edges of thought, easing the transition into rest without asking for anything in return. Worries lost their urgency. Plans dissolved before they could fully form. Attention narrowed gently, turning inward toward breath and weight and warmth. The mind followed the body, slowing its pace to match the quiet settling of limbs. Sleep arrived not as an invitation, but as a consequence. It did not need encouragement. It followed naturally from depletion, filling the space left behind when effort finally ceased. In this way, exhaustion became a kind of guide, leading the body into rest when comfort was unavailable. It asked nothing. It promised nothing. It simply carried the body into stillness, allowing it to remain there long enough to continue when morning came. Pain did not vanish, but it dulled, retreating just enough to allow sleep to take hold. A sore back, aching hands, stiff joints all remained present, but their urgency faded. The body learned how to rest alongside discomfort, not waiting for it to resolve. This tolerance was not chosen. It was practiced over time, refined through repetition, until sleep could coexist with pain rather than depend on its absence. Hunger lingered quietly. It did not wake the body fully, but it did not disappear either. The stomach remained aware of its own emptiness, its signal softened by fatigue, but not erased. Sleep wrapped around hunger like a thin blanket, muting its sharpness while leaving its presence intact. The promise of morning carried it forward unresolved, but managed. Dreams, when they came, were often simple. They did not transport the mind far from waking life. Instead, they echoed at movements repeated without purpose, tasks resumed without urgency, paths walked again without destination. Unfinished work returned gently, not as anxiety, but as familiarity. The mind did not wander into imagination. It stayed close to the body's experience, replaying what had already been lived. In this way, sleep mirrored the day that preceded it. It did not offer escape or transformation. It offered continuity. Rest flowed naturally from exhaustion shaped by the same forces that shaped waking life. The body accepted this without protest, slipping into stillness, not because conditions were ideal, but because endurance had taught it how to rest within whatever conditions were available. Night also carried vigilance. Parents listened for children. Caregivers remained alert to illness. A change in breathing, a restless movement, a cough in the dark could pull someone instantly back into wakefulness. Sleep was light, not because people feared the night, but because responsibility did not disappear with daylight. Attention rested, but it did not fully release. For some, night offered the only moments of relative stillness. They would know moments so quiet they almost felt unfamiliar. During the day, the body was always moving or preparing to move, responding constantly to need and obligation. At night, that demand eased slightly. A few breaths could be taken without urgency, drawn deeper into the chest, and released more slowly without the immediate requirement to act. In these brief intervals, awareness turned inward. The body registered itself not in motion, but at rest weight. Supported muscles no longer engaged hands lying open rather than working. This awareness was subtle and easily overlooked, yet it carried significance. It reminded the body of a state it rarely inhabited, one where effort paused and sensation softened. These moments were small and easily missed, sometimes slipping by unnoticed between half-waking and sleep. Yet they mattered deeply. They allowed the body to reset, not to fullness or comfort, but to function. Tension released just enough. Balance returned just enough. Strength gathered quietly without ceremony. There was no expectation that rest would restore everything that had been taken by the day. The body did not wait for renewal or comfort. It did not imagine waking whole or light or free of strain. Such hopes belong to a world with margins wide enough to allow them. Instead, the body learned to accept maintenance, to settle for what was sufficient rather than what was ideal. These moments of stillness were not about feeling better. They were about being able to continue. Muscles did not seek to recover fully. They sought only to release enough tension to move again. Breath did not deepen for pleasure, but for function. Pain was not expected to disappear, only to soften enough to be carried forward. In this way, rest became practical rather than restorative, shaped by necessity rather than desire. The body adjusted its expectations quietly. It learned what could be asked of rest and what could not. It accepted that fatigue would remain, that hunger might return, that weariness would not be undone overnight. What mattered was balance, not relief. The careful holding together of strength, just sufficient to meet the next demand. And in that quiet acceptance, the body found what it needed, not abundance, not ease, not renewal in any complete sense, but sufficiency. Enough steadiness to stand, enough clarity to move, enough resilience to endure the day as it arrived. When morning came and the city resumed its steady demand, the body rose not because it was restored, but because it was ready enough. And in this readiness, modest and unremarkable life continued. As the hours passed, the city shifted again, not abruptly, but with the quiet confidence of repetition. Those who worked at night moved through the streets with familiarity, bakers tending ovens that never fully cooled, guards making slow, deliberate rounds. Laborers beginning their work before dawn thinned the darkness. Their movements were steady and purposeful, part of a rhythm that did not pause simply because others slept. For those half awake, these sounds were not disruptions. They were reminders. Time was always moving, even when the body lay still. The boundary between night and day remained porous, defined less by light than by activity. Darkness lingered, yet work had already resumed. Ovens glowed while streets remained dim. Voices rose softly before the sky changed color. The city did not wait for morning to begin again. It transitioned gradually, layering one cycle over another without clear separation. Toward morning, the shift became more noticeable, though still subtle. A door opened quietly, somewhere nearby. Footsteps returned to familiar paths. Carts rolled past earlier than before. The air changed, carrying with it a faint promise of movement, cooler, fresher, edged with expectation. Bodies responded before minds did. Muscles tightened slightly, breathing adjusted. The body prepared itself instinctively to rise again, even while sleep still lingered. Sleep loosened its hold without resistance. It did not end dramatically. It faded, releasing people back into routine as gently as it had arrived. Eyes opened slowly, movement resumed cautiously. The day reasserted itself not as a new beginning, but as a continuation. There was no reflection on the day that had passed, and little anticipation of the one to come. Life did not encourage such distance or abstraction. Thought stayed close to necessity. What mattered was what needed to be done next, not what had already been endured, or what might arrive later. Memory did not linger. Expectation did not stretch far ahead. Instead, life flowed forward, carried by habit and necessity, guided by routines learned so deeply they no longer required attention. Each night ended not with closure or resolution, but with continuation. The city did not reset. It simply shifted, and the people within it shifted as well, rising again into movement, carrying forward whatever strength the night had quietly allowed them to reclaim. In this way, sleep in 18th century Paris was not an escape from life, but part of its rhythm, another form of endurance, another way of managing limitation. It did not offer renewal so much as maintenance, enough rest to stand, enough stillness to continue. And so the city moved through night, as it moved through day, held together by countless ordinary bodies, rising and resting in turn. Their lives were not recorded carefully. Their nights left no trace. Yet with each quiet descent into sleep, they sustained the future of the city itself, one breath, one shared room, one unfinished day at a time. In 18th century Paris, change did not arrive with a single sound or a single moment that could be named and remembered. It did not announce itself through upheaval or clear beginnings. Instead, it gathered slowly, almost invisibly, settling into life through repetition. Days returned in familiar shapes. Mornings asked the same questions. Evenings closed with the same fatigue. And bodies adapted quietly and continuously to what was asked of them again and again. Ordinary people did not speak of transformation because transformation felt too large, too distant from the scale of daily survival. They spoke of tomorrow, of what would be needed next, of whether bread would still be affordable, whether work would still be available, whether strength would last another day. Their language stayed close to necessity, anchored in the immediate future rather than imagined horizons. And yet tomorrow arrived again and again, carrying the same demands with unwavering consistency. Each arrival asked for calculation: how much to spend, how much to save, how much effort could still be given. These calculations were not written down or debated openly. They were performed internally, instinctively shaped by habit rather than choice. Quiet endurance became the measure by which days were navigated. Over time, this repetition did something subtle. It reshaped expectation. What once felt temporary began to feel permanent. What once felt manageable began to feel heavy. The body adjusted first, learning new limits, accepting new thresholds of fatigue. The mind followed more slowly, registering patterns without naming them, recognizing imbalance without framing it as injustice. Change in this sense did not feel like movement forward or backward. It felt like pressure, like weight accumulating without being noticed until it altered posture and pace. People continued as they always had, yet something within that continuation had shifted. Tomorrow no longer felt like a fresh attempt. It felt like another iteration. And so change gathered not through interruption, but through persistence. It lived in the space between what effort promised and what it delivered. It grew in the quiet gap between endurance and relief. Unseen, unnamed, and uncelebrated, it formed slowly within the rhythm of ordinary lives, waiting not for a moment, but for enough moments to finally make itself felt. Time passed, not as a sequence of events, but as accumulation. Each day added a small weight to the body and the mind. Hunger managed, fatigue tolerated, illness endured, loss absorbed. None of these alone felt extraordinary. Together over years, they shaped a shared understanding of life, one built not on expectation, but on adjustment. People learned to live close to limits, not by choice, but by necessity. These limits were not clearly marked or discussed. They revealed themselves gradually through trial and error, through days that demanded slightly more than the body expected to give. Over time, people learned how far effort could stretch before it failed, not through theory, but through sensation. Through the moment when hands began to shake, when breath shortened, when a task that had once felt manageable suddenly required care. They learned how little rest could sustain them. Sleep was measured not by comfort, but by outcome. Enough rest meant the ability to stand again, to lift again, to walk again. Anything beyond that felt excessive, almost unfamiliar. The body recalibrated its expectations quietly, accepting shorter nights, lighter meals, smaller pauses. Rest became functional rather than restorative, valued for what it allowed rather than how it felt. They also learned how much uncertainty could be carried without breaking routine. Worry was present, but it had limits too. Too much would slow movement, disrupt attention, interfere with the day's demands. So uncertainty was portioned carefully, absorbed in small amounts. People learned to carry questions without answers, to plan, without guarantees, to proceed without assurance. Routine acted as a stabilizer, holding life together, even when outcomes remained unclear. These lessons were not taught formally. No one explained them. They were learned through living, through repetition, through watching others do the same. Children observed adults adjusting pace, conserving strength, choosing when to pause and when to push forward. Neighbors noticed who endured illness, who returned to work, who disappeared quietly. Knowledge passed sideways through example rather than instruction. Over time, this understanding settled deeply. It moved from conscious decision into instinct. The body responded before the mind could intervene. Limits were sensed rather than calculated. Choices were made quickly, almost automatically, shaped by experience stored in muscle and habit. In this way, survival became intuitive. Life near the edge did not feel dramatic. It felt familiar. And within that familiarity, people continued carefully, deliberately, carrying forward a way of living shaped entirely by what could be endured and no more. The city itself reflected this accumulation. Streets grew more crowded rooms, more compressed. The same paths were walked again and again, worn smooth by feet that had no alternative routes. Buildings aged alongside their inhabitants. Repairs were made only when failure could no longer be postponed. Everything functioned just enough to continue. Work remained constant, woven into every day with the same insistence as before. It was still necessary, still exhausting, still uncertain. Bodies rose and moved because they had to. Hands performed tasks learned long ago. The rhythm of labor did not change, and from the outside, life appeared to continue as it always had. Shops opened, tools were lifted, streets filled with movement. Nothing announced that anything was different. Yet beneath this familiarity, meaning began to shift. Quietly, without confrontation, an awareness grew. Effort did not always lead to stability. Days filled with labor could still end in uncertainty. Weeks of steady work did not guarantee security. Hard work, once understood as the surest path to survival, began to feel less dependable, not suddenly, but gradually through repetition that failed to produce reassurance. Endurance, too, changed its character. It no longer felt like a bridge toward relief. It became something sustained for its own sake, without promise of improvement. People endured not because endurance was rewarded, but because stopping was impossible. The link between persistence and outcome weakened, and this weakening was noticed not intellectually, but experientially. These realizations did not arrive as arguments or declarations. They did not take the form of complaints shouted aloud or demands made openly. Instead, they arrived as recognition. A look exchanged when wages failed to stretch far enough. A pause in conversation when prices rose again. A shared silence when effort met the same limits it had met the week before. Understanding spread quietly without language, carried through observation rather than debate. Households absorbed this awareness first. Calculations became more careful. Expectations narrowed. Conversations lingered on comparisons, what had once been enough, what now barely was. Neighborhoods shared this recognition through proximity and habit. People noticed patterns repeating across different lives, different streets, different trades. The problem was not isolated, it was familiar. Still, work continued. No one stopped because meaning had shifted. Labor remained the structure holding life together. But it no longer carried the same promise. It became something endured rather than trusted. In this way, the city moved forward under the weight of a quiet understanding that effort alone was no longer a guarantee, and that endurance, while necessary, was no longer enough to explain why life felt as it did. The change was subtle, but it mattered. It altered how people carried their days, how they measured their strength, how they understood the relationship between what they gave and what they received. And though nothing had been said aloud, the recognition had already settled, shared silently across households and neighborhoods, shaping thought long before it ever approached expression. Conversation reflected this shift. People still spoke cautiously, but topics lingered a little longer. Complaints were framed as observations rather than grievances. Comparisons were made between prices now and prices remembered, between effort given and return received. These exchanges were not revolutionary. They were reflective. They allowed patterns to be noticed. Religion continued to offer structure, steady and familiar, even as the city itself grew heavier with repetition. Rituals remained unchanged in their outward form, comforting precisely because they returned the same way each week, each season. Prayers were spoken in the same words. Gestures followed the same order. The calendar still turned according to holy days that promised rhythm in a life otherwise shaped by uncertainty. For many, this familiarity mattered deeply. It anchored time. It softened disorder. And yet beneath this continuity, the role of faith began to shift, almost imperceptibly. For some, belief no longer explained everything it once had. Suffering did not feel temporary in the way sermons sometimes suggested. Hardship lingered longer than expected. The connection between virtue and outcome grew less clear. These changes did not provoke rejection or anger. They settled quietly, like a question left unanswered rather than a conviction overturned. Prayer continued, but its tone altered subtly. It became less about certainty and more about endurance. People prayed not always for change, but for the ability to continue to bear what had already arrived. The act of prayer itself remained meaningful, even when answers felt distant. It offered stillness repetition, a space to hold fear without speaking it aloud. Questions hovered nearby, present but unvoiced. They were not discussed openly, not shaped into arguments. They existed as feeling rather than thought, as a slight hesitation where confidence had once been. Belief remained, but certainty thinned. Faith did not disappear. It adjusted, becoming quieter, less declarative, more inward. In this way, religion continued to shape life, but no longer as a complete explanation. It offered order without resolution, comfort without clarity, and for many, that was enough. In a world where so little could be controlled or understood, belief did not need to answer every question. It needed only to accompany people through repetition, through uncertainty, through days that asked for endurance more than understanding. Entertainment, too, carried hints of change. Songs and stories shifted tone slightly, incorporating humor sharper than before, irony more pointed. Performers responded to their audiences, adjusting language and emphasis. Laughter still mattered, but it sometimes carried an edge, an acknowledgement of shared strain rather than simple relief. Within households, expectations evolved. Children learned early not only how to work, but how to observe. They absorbed conversations, moods, silences. They noticed tension even when it was managed carefully. Their understanding of the world formed not through explanation, but through atmosphere. What they learned was not discontent, but awareness. Illness and death continued as before, yet their presence reinforced fragility. Loss was no longer only personal, it felt cumulative. Each absence added to a sense that life could be interrupted at any moment, regardless of effort or virtue. This awareness sharpened attention to fairness not as an abstract concept, but as a lived question. Still, life continued. The city did not pause for reflection. People rose each morning, fetched water, sought bread, went to work. The rhythm remained intact. But within that rhythm, something had shifted. Endurance was no longer only a skill. It had become a measure. Time accumulated quietly in this way. It pressed not through force, but through repetition. Each day that resembled the last added another layer of recognition. Not anger, not rebellion, recognition. Ordinary people did not imagine themselves as agents of history. They did not speak of futures shaped by their actions. They spoke of getting through the week. And yet history was forming precisely there in the daily calculations, in the shared adjustments, in the growing distance between effort and outcome. The city carried this tension without naming it. It moved as it always had, supported by labor habit and routine. But beneath the surface, the meaning of those routines had changed. What once felt inevitable now felt heavy. What once felt sufficient now felt strained. Time, patient and unremarkable, continued its work. No single day marked the difference. No moment announced that things were no longer the same. Instead, the city drifted toward awareness, one ordinary day at a time. Endurance continued, but it carried questions alongside it. Quiet ones, persistent ones. And so, as Paris moved forward through its crowded streets and narrow rooms, through work and rest, through illness and brief relief, it carried with it a weight that had been building for years, not yet expressed, not yet resolved, simply present, time accumulated. And with it, the conditions for change shaped not by sudden awakening, but by the long, patient experience of ordinary lives continuing day after day until continuation itself began to feel different. As this story begins to settle and the streets of Paris slowly fade back into darkness, there is no grand ending waiting for us. No single moment when everything changes at once. The people you've met tonight did not know they were living on the edge of history. They did not wake up expecting revolutions. They woke up expecting another day, another loaf of bread, to find another task, to finish another night, to make it through. For most of them, life was not dramatic. It was repetitive, heavy, quietly exhausting. And yet, it was within these ordinary routines, the crowded rooms, the long hours, the endless waiting, that the foundations of change were laid. Not through speeches, but through hunger. Not through ideology, but through endurance. When the world eventually shifted, it did so on the backs of people who had already learned how to survive without certainty. People who had practiced patience long before they practiced resistance. If you're listening to this as you drift towards sleep, you don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to carry any conclusions with you. Perhaps it's enough to remember this, that history is not only shaped by those who rule, but by those who live quietly within the rules until living quietly becomes impossible. If you're still awake, you're welcome to leave a comment telling us where you are and what time it is right now. And if you find comfort in these slow journeys through the past, consider subscribing so we can travel together again. For now, let the city rest, let the voices grow distant, and allow yourself to rest as well. Good night.